On the morning of November 15, 1315, Europe's strongest idea walked into a mountain pass and never walked out again. 9,000 knights marched forward in perfect order. Their armor cost more than villages earned in a year. Their bloodlines went back centuries. Their banners carried the promise that this world worked the way it always had, nobles ruled, peasants obeyed, and steel decided who was right. They believed this march was routine. They believed farmers would run. They believed confidence was protection. By noon, that belief was underwater. Some knights drowned without ever seeing an enemy. Their armor, built to make them invincible, dragged them beneath frozen lake water like anchors. Others lay broken in mud and ice, pulled off their horses by farmers using hooks meant for animals, not men of noble birth. There were no heroic charges, no glorious last stands, no ransom negotiations. Only confusion, physics, and a mountain doing exactly what mountains do when pushed. This wasn't a battle fought for honor. It wasn't a clash of equal forces. It wasn't even a rebellion in the way Europe understood rebellion. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that power only works when everyone agrees to believe in it. A demonstration that hierarchy collapses the moment it meets terrain, preparation, and people who stop asking permission to exist. A demonstration that steel does not float, horses panic, and confidence becomes useless when the ground itself turns against you. By the end of the day, Europe's most respected warriors were dead, drowning, or fleeing in silence, and no one could explain how it happened without admitting something far more dangerous than defeat. That peasants had figured out the system. And broken it. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. For hundreds of years before Morgarten, Europe worked in a way that felt permanent. Not because it was fair, but because it was familiar. Everyone knew their place, and most people never imagined that place could change. At the top were the nobles. They owned the land. They collected taxes. They decided laws. They claimed this power came from God, blood, and history. Beneath them were knights, trained for war since childhood, wrapped in steel, taught that their purpose was to enforce this order. And at the bottom were peasants, farmers, herders, laborers, people who worked the land until their bodies failed and died without ever owning the soil beneath their feet. This system did not survive because it was loved. It survived because it worked. Knights were expensive. Their armor took years to make. Their horses required care, food, and land. Their training started when they were children. All of this made them terrifying on the battlefield. When knights charged, villages burned. When knights arrived, resistance ended. And because resistance always failed, people stopped trying. Over time, that created belief. People stopped seeing knights as men and started seeing them as proof that the hierarchy was natural, permanent, and unstoppable. If peasants lost every time, then maybe they were supposed to lose. If nobles always won, maybe they were meant to rule. This belief was the real foundation of power. But far away from castles and open fields, deep in the Swiss Alps, that belief never fully settled. The mountain communities of Ui, Schwyz, and Unterwalden lived in places where horses struggled and armies moved slowly. Farming was hard. Travel was dangerous. Winters were long. These were not lands that rewarded luxury or ceremony. They rewarded memory, patience, and knowing exactly where to step. Because of old legal agreements and geographic accidents, these communities did not answer to local nobles. They paid taxes directly to the Holy Roman Emperor. They governed themselves in small assemblies where ordinary men voted. No castles. No feudal lords living nearby. No knights riding through to remind them who was in charge. To the rest of Europe, this was strange but tolerable, at first. Then trade changed everything. The St. Gotthard Pass ran straight through these mountains. It connected northern Europe to Italy, where money flowed through banking, spices, silk, and contracts. Whoever controlled that pass controlled trade, movement, and influence. And control is something powerful people never ignore. The Habsburg saw the Swiss lands not as communities, but as a problem waiting to spread. If farmers could govern themselves here, others might ask why they couldn't do the same. That question was dangerous. At first, the Swiss tried to solve this the proper way. They sent petitions. They appealed to law. They waited. Nothing happened. Silence answered them. That silence carried a message: coexistence was never an option. So the Swiss stopped asking. They didn't prepare speeches. They didn't gather banners. They prepared the mountain. And far away, Duke Leopold of Austria was preparing something very different, an army meant to remind everyone how the world was supposed to work. He believed this march would end an argument. He did not understand that it was about to end a belief instead. Duke Leopold did not see himself as starting a war. From his perspective, this was correction. Restoration. A necessary response to people who had forgotten their place. For generations, noble authority had been enforced the same way across Europe: show overwhelming force, crush resistance quickly, and move on. The pattern worked because it always had. So Leopold followed the pattern. By autumn of 1315, knights arrived from across Habsburg lands. Men raised on stories of glory. Men trained from childhood to ride, strike, and command. Men whose armor alone represented more wealth than most peasants would see in several lifetimes. Horses were polished. Banners were unfurled. Armor gleamed even under grey alpine skies. Chroniclers later noted something important about this army. It was calm. There was no fear. No urgency. No sense that anything unpredictable might happen. The knights talked, joked, and complained about the cold. This was not an army expecting a fight. This was an army expecting obedience. They believed peasants always ran. History told them so. Their armor told them so. The plan was simple. March through the Morgarten Pass, occupy the cantons, install loyal administrators, and restore order. No negotiation. No compromise. Just a reminder. The Morgarten Pass did not look dangerous to them. On one side was a steep, forested slope. On the other, a lake, cold, dark, and partially frozen in November. Between them, a narrow road barely wide enough for a marching column. Tight, yes. Uncomfortable, yes. But peasants would never attack here. That much was obvious. Because peasants fought like peasants. Or so they believed. The army entered the pass in dense formation. Knights in the center. Lighter troops on the sides. Supply wagons behind. Horses slipped slightly on the icy ground, but no one slowed. The march moved at the pace of inevitability, the pace of men who believe the outcome is already decided. What they did not see was above them. Hidden in the trees, farmers and herders watched silently. Men who had walked these slopes since childhood. Men who knew where the ground held firm and where it betrayed weight. They had not gathered to fight in the way knights expected. They had gathered to wait. For weeks, they had moved stones. Heavy ones. Logs cut from thick trees. Everything placed carefully along the slope, held back by wooden barriers and rope. This was not anger spilling over. This was preparation. They did not intend to meet steel with steel. They intended to let gravity do the work. As the Habsburg column moved deeper into the pass, space vanished. Horses pressed close together. Riders lost the ability to turn. Retreat became complicated. Escape became unlikely. Still, confidence held. No scouts reported danger. No horn sounded alarms. No one looked up long enough to see what was waiting. Because confidence moves forward. It does not look for traps. And when the army reached the narrowest point of the pass, when the front was committed and the rear fully enclosed, the Swiss decided the time for waiting was over. They did not shout. They did not announce themselves. They simply cut the ropes. The attack did not begin with shouting. There were no horns. No battle cries. No warning at all. What the knights heard first was a sound they did not recognize as danger, a sharp crack, like wood snapping under stress. Then another. then many at once. Ropes breaking. Barriers failing. Gravity waking up. Above them, the mountain started to move. The first boulders did not fall straight down. They bounced. They struck rock, changed direction, and picked up speed. Stones the size of barrels slammed into the packed column with the force of siege weapons. Horses were hit first. Legs shattered. Bodies collapsed. Riders were thrown sideways into other men, into wagons, into the lake. Then the logs came. Thick tree trunks rolled end over end, smashing into armor and bone alike. A knight trained to face arrows and lances had no defense against a forest coming downhill. Shields were useless. Formations dissolved instantly. Orders became meaningless noise swallowed by crashing stone and screaming animals. The column broke in seconds. Some knights were knocked directly into the lake. The ice shattered under their weight. Cold water swallowed them whole. Armor that had once made them untouchable dragged them down immediately. There was no swimming. There was no rescue. Steel does not float. Others stayed on land and learned that was not safer. Horses panicked. Riderless animals ran blindly through the pass, trampling wounded men, spreading chaos. Supply wagons overturned. The road vanished beneath bodies and debris. Knights tried to stand, to regroup, to remember their training. But training assumes space. It assumes a front. It assumes an enemy that approaches. There was none. That was when the Swiss came down. They did not charge. They flowed. They moved through trees and rocks with the ease of people who knew every step. They carried no banners. They wore no armor worth mentioning. They held halberds, simple weapons with a blade, a spike, and a hook. They used the hook first. A halberd caught a shoulder plate. A neck guard. The edge of a breastplate. One hard pull, and a knight came off his horse. Armor made the fall worse. The weight pinned him. Before he could rise, the blade came down, not on the chest, not on the shield, but into gaps. Under the arm. At the neck. At the groin. Armor worked well in open battle. Here, it became a cage. Some knights fought back. A few managed to draw swords. Small groups locked shields and tried to form circles. But there was no line to hold, no rescue coming, no retreat possible. Every direction led to death, rocks above, water beside, peasants everywhere. The Swiss did not take prisoners. There were no ransoms. No negotiations. No rules recognized. These were men who had been taxed, threatened, ignored, and told their independence was temporary. They understood exactly what losing meant. So they did not stop. Chroniclers later wrote about knights begging, offering gold, invoking noble customs. None of it mattered. This was not a tournament. This was not war as Europe understood it. This was removal. Some knights crawled toward the lake, away from the hooks and blades. They reached the shore, looked back, and made a decision. They walked into the water on purpose. They knew what would happen. They chose it anyway. The fighting lasted less than 2 hours. When it ended, the pass was silent except for wind and water. Thousands of bodies lay broken among rocks and ice. An army that had marched in certain of obedience had been dismantled piece by men who never planned to fight fair. The mountain had done its job. And Europe would spend generations trying to explain why. Duke Leopold survived. That alone confused people. He escaped early with a small group of knights who managed to break free before the pass completely collapsed. They rode hard, didn't look back, and carried with them a problem far worse than defeat. They had lived. And now they had to explain how. Back in noble courts across Europe, the questions came quickly. How could trained knights be destroyed by farmers? How could armor, bloodlines, and decades of training fail so completely? How could a system that had worked for centuries collapse in less than 2 hours? No one liked the answers. So most accounts avoided them. Some chroniclers blamed the terrain. They said the Morgarten Pass was uniquely dangerous. Too narrow. Too steep. Too icy. An unfortunate location. A mistake anyone could have made. Others blamed the weather. Early winter. Thin ice. Fog. Bad luck. Forces beyond human control. A few reached for darker explanations. Witchcraft. Demons. Divine punishment for arrogance. God choosing to humble the proud. But even those explanations were dangerous. Because if God sided with peasants once, what stopped him from doing it again? What almost no official account admitted was the simplest truth. The Swiss had planned better. They had treated war like a problem to solve, not a performance to stage. They didn't rely on bravery or tradition. They relied on physics, timing, and local knowledge. They didn't meet knights where knights were strongest. They forced them into a place where every advantage became a weakness. Heavy armor slowed movement. Horses panicked in confined spaces. Training designed for open fields meant nothing in a trap. This truth spread anyway. Not through official letters. Not through noble announcements. It spread through merchants, mercenaries, servants, and travelers. People who talked. People who listened. And what they heard terrified them. If peasants could do this once, they could do it again. Across Europe, nobles grew uneasy. Not because they feared Swiss farmers specifically, but because Morgarten proved something larger. The hierarchy was not protected by nature or God. It was protected by assumptions. And assumptions could be broken. The Swiss understood this immediately. They did not celebrate loudly. They did not chase glory. They signed agreements. Ui, Schwyz, and Unterwalden formed a mutual defense pact. They formalized cooperation. They prepared for the future. They knew Morgarten would not be the last attempt to crush them. And they were right. Over the following decades, more cantons joined. The Confederation grew. Their infantry became feared across Europe. Not because they were individually superior, but because they did not break. They held formation. They remembered Morgarten. Other armies paid attention too. Commanders began choosing terrain carefully. They avoided narrow passes. They questioned cavalry charges. They studied how peasants had pulled knights from horses and killed them on the ground. The lesson was spreading. War was changing. Knights did not disappear overnight. Feudalism did not collapse immediately. But doubt had entered the system, permanent, spreading doubt. And once doubt exists, power must constantly defend itself. Morgarten had not destroyed an army. It had destroyed certainty. And that made it far more dangerous. Morgarten was supposed to be forgotten. That was the quiet hope of Europe's ruling class. Battles were lost before. Armies failed. Mistakes happened. If this defeat could be framed as an accident, bad terrain, bad weather, bad luck, then the system could survive without change. But Morgarten refused to stay contained. Because the lesson was too simple. You didn't need noble blood to win. You didn't need expensive armor. You didn't need permission. You needed preparation, discipline, and the refusal to fight on someone else's terms. That idea traveled faster than armies. Mercenaries talked. They always did. Men who sold their swords had no reason to protect noble pride. They described how Swiss farmers stood their ground. How knights drowned in their own armor. How the mountain itself became a weapon. Urban militias listened closely. In towns across Europe, craftsmen and laborers had already been forming militias to protect trade and property. Morgarten gave them proof that they weren't pretending to be soldiers. They could be soldiers if they fought correctly. Slowly, tactics changed. Infantry formations grew tighter. Long spears and pikes replaced swords meant for individual combat. Men trained to hold position instead of chasing glory. Commanders learned to force cavalry into bad ground, mud, slopes, narrow approaches. Knights still charged. But more often now, they died doing it. At Courtrai, Flemish militias stopped French cavalry and killed knights in city streets. At Crécy, English longbowmen destroyed noble charges by choosing terrain and refusing to meet knights on their terms. Each battle repeated the same message Morgarten had delivered years earlier. The system was not invincible. The Swiss became living proof. They were hired as mercenaries across Europe, not because they were flashy, but because they were reliable. They did not flee. They held formation. They fought without illusion. Kings trusted them. Even the Pope surrounded himself with Swiss guards, a quiet admission that peasants who once defied nobility were now trusted to protect it. Switzerland itself survived. Not untouched. Not without blood. But unconquered. Habsburg armies returned again and again over the next 2 centuries. They brought new plans, more men, heavier weapons. Sometimes they won battles. Sometimes they lost. But they never erased the Confederation. The cost was too high. Every attempt reminded Europe of Morgarten. Every failure reopened the doubt. Every success felt temporary. Power had learned something it could not unlearn. That force works best when people believe in it. That belief, once broken, never fully returns. The old hierarchy adjusted. It adapted. It armored itself with law, bureaucracy, and money. But the fear remained, quiet, constant, and justified. Because somewhere in the Alps, there was proof that when ordinary people stopped defending and started planning, they could kill ideas that had ruled for centuries. Morgarten was not the end of feudal power. It was the moment feudal power learned it could bleed. The Morgarten path still exists. You can walk it today. The slope is still steep. The lake is still cold and deep. The ground still narrows in the same quiet, unforgiving way. Nothing about the landscape explains itself. Nothing announces what happened there. That is fitting. Because the most important thing Morgarten changed was invisible. Before that November morning in 1315, Europe's power rested on something stronger than armies. It rested on belief. The belief that some men were born to command and others to obey. That armor, training, and bloodlines were proof of superiority. That hierarchy was not just enforced, but natural. Morgarten did not argue against that belief. It demonstrated its failure. 9,000 knights entered the pass expecting submission. They believed the presence of banners and steel would be enough. They believed confidence itself was a weapon. They never considered that confidence could be used against them. The Swiss did not defeat knights by becoming better knights. They defeated them by refusing the rules entirely. They ignored honor. They ignored tradition. They ignored the idea that war was a stage where virtue mattered more than outcome. They treated war as engineering. They asked simple questions. Where will the enemy be slow? Where can gravity help? What happens when horses panic? What happens when armor becomes weight instead of protection? Then they acted. The result lasted far longer than the fighting. The battle itself was over in less than 2 hours. The consequences stretched across centuries. Military tactics shifted. Infantry rose. Cavalry dominance weakened. Commanders learned to fear terrain more than bravery. But the deeper change was psychological. After Morgarten, no noble could fully believe in invincibility again. No knight could completely trust that armor guaranteed survival. No system built on obedience could ignore the possibility that obedience might end. Switzerland became a permanent contradiction, a republic of farmers and townsmen in the heart of monarchical Europe. A place that proved independence could be defended without castles or kings. A reminder that power does not descend from heaven fully formed. It is constructed, maintained, and vulnerable. That knowledge spread quietly. It did not spark immediate revolutions. It did not erase inequality overnight. But it planted doubt. And doubt is patient. It waits. Every time a ruler overreached. Every time authority relied on fear alone. Every time people were told resistance was impossible. Somewhere beneath that message, Morgarten whispered otherwise. The knights who drowned in frozen water did not just lose a battle. They carried an idea to the bottom with them, the idea that hierarchy was unbreakable, that obedience was permanent, that power needed no explanation. The mountain did not care about bloodlines. The lake did not care about armor. Physics did not care about tradition. And neither, it turned out, did people who had stopped asking permission to exist. That is what made Morgarten dangerous. Not the bodies. Not the defeat. But the realization that power only works until the moment people learn how to dismantle it. And once they do, nothing is ever quite the same again.